A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, James Joyce, Part 2. He took up his knife and fork again in good humour and set to eating, saying to Mr. Casey, "Let us have the story, John. It will help us to digest." Stephen looked with affection at Mr. Casey's face, which stared across the table over his joined hands. He liked to sit near him at the fire, looking up at his dark, fierce face. But his dark eyes were never fierce, and his slow voice was good to listen to. But why was he then against the priests? Because Dante must be right then. But he had heard his father say that she was a spoiled nun, and that she had come out of the convent in the Alleghenies, when her brother had got the money from the savages for the trinkets and the cheneys. Perhaps that made her severe against Parnell, and she did not like him to play with Eileen, because Eileen was a Protestant, and when she was young, she knew children that used to play with Protestants, and the Protestants used to make fun of the litany of the Blessed Virgin. Tower of Ivory, they used to say, House of Gold. How could a woman be a tower of ivory or a house of gold? Who was right then? And he remembered the evening in the infirmary in Clongowes, the dark waters, the light at the pierhead, and the moan of sorrow from the people when they had heard. Eileen had long white hands. One evening when playing tig, she had put her hands over his eyes, long and white and thin and cold and soft. That was ivory, a cold, white thing. That was the meaning of Tower of Ivory. "The story is very short and sweet," Mr. Casey said. "It was one day down in Arklow, a cold, bitter day, not long before the chief died. May God have mercy on him." He closed his eyes wearily and paused. Mr. Dedalus took a bone from his plate and tore some meat from it with his teeth, saying, "Before he was killed, you mean?" Mr. Casey opened his eyes, sighed, and went on. "It was down in Arklow one day. We were down there at a meeting, and after the meeting was over, we had to make our way to the railway station through the crowd. Such booing and baying, man, you never heard. They called us all the names in the world. Well, there was one old lady, and a drunken old harridan she was surely, that paid all her attention to me. She kept dancing along beside me in the mud, bawling and screaming into my face. 'Priest Hunter, the Paris funds! Mr. Fox, Kitty O'Shea!' "And what did you do, John?" asked Mr. Dedalus. "I let her bawl away," said Mr. Casey. "It was a cold day, and to keep up my heart I had, saving your presence, ma'am, a quid of Tullamore in my mouth, and sure I couldn't say a word in any case, because my mouth was full of tobacco juice." "Well, John?" "Well, I let her bawl away, to her heart's content, Kitty O'Shea and the rest of it, till at last she called that lady a name that I won't sully this Christmas board, nor your ears, ma'am, nor my own lips by repeating." He paused. Mr. Dedalus, lifting his head from the bone, asked, "And what did you do, John?" "Do," said Mr. Casey. "She stuck her ugly old face up at me when she said it, and I had my mouth full of tobacco juice. I bent down to her, and 'Poth,' says I to her like that." He turned aside and made the act of spitting. Says I to her like that, right into her eye. He clapped his hand to his eye and gave a hoarse scream of pain. "Oh, Jesus, Mary and Joseph," says she, I'm blinded and drownded." He stopped in a fit of coughing and laughter, repeating, "I'm blinded entirely." Mr. Dedalus laughed loudly and lay back in his chair while Uncle Charles swayed his head to and fro. Dante looked terribly angry and repeated while they laughed, "Very nice, ha, very nice." It was not nice about the spit in the woman's eye, but what was the name the woman had called Kitty O'Shea that Mr. Casey would not repeat? He thought of Mr. Casey walking through the crowds of people and making speeches from a wagonette. That was what he had been in prison for, and he remembered that one night Sergeant O'Neill had come to the house and had stood in the hall, talking in a low voice with his father and chewing nervously at the chin-strap of his cap. And that night, Mr. Casey had not gone to Dublin by train, but a car had come to the door, and he had heard his father say something about the Cabinteely road. He was for Ireland and Parnell, and so was his father. And so was Dante too, for one night at the band on the esplanade, she had hit a gentleman on the head with her umbrella because he had taken off his hat when the band played God Save the Queen at the end. Mr. Dedalus gave a snort of contempt. "Ah, John," he said, "it is true for them. We are an unfortunate priest-ridden race, and always were and always will be till the end of the chapter." Uncle Charles shook his head, saying, "A bad business, a bad business." Mr. Dedalus repeated, "A priest-ridden, God-forsaken race." He pointed to the portrait of his grandfather on the wall to his right. "Do you see that old chap up there, John?" he said. "He was a good Irishman when there was no money in the job. He was condemned to death as a white boy. But he had a saying about our clerical friends, that he would never let one of them put his 2 feet under his mahogany." Dante broke in angrily. "If we are a priest-ridden race, we ought to be proud of it. They are the apple of God's eye. Touch them not, says Christ, for they are the apple of my eye." "And can we not love our country then?" asked Mr. Casey. "Are we not to follow the man that was born to lead us?" "A traitor to his country," replied Dante. "A traitor, an adulterer. The priests were right to abandon him. The priests were always the true friends of Ireland." "Were they, Faith?" said Mr. Casey. He threw his fist on the table and, frowning angrily, protruded one finger after another. "Didn't the bishops of Ireland betray us in the time of the Union when Bishop Lanigan presented an address of loyalty to the Marquis Cornwallis? Didn't the bishops and priests sell the aspirations of their country in 1829 in return for Catholic emancipation? Didn't they denounce the Fenian movement from the pulpit and in the confession box? And didn't they dishonor the ashes of Terence Bellew McManus?" His face was glowing with anger, and Stephen felt the glow rise to his own cheek as the spoken words thrilled him. Mr. Dedalus uttered a guffaw of coarse scorn. "Oh, by God," he cried, "I forgot little old Paul Cullen, another apple of God's eye." Dante bent across the table and cried to Mr. Casey, "Right, right, they were always right. God and morality and religion come first." Mrs. Dedalus, seeing her excitement, said to her, "Mrs. Reardon, don't excite yourself answering them." "God and religion before everything," Dante cried. "God and religion before the world." Mr. Casey raised his clenched fist and brought it down on the table with a crash. "Very well, then," he shouted hoarsely. "If it comes to that, no God for Ireland." "John! John!" cried Mr. Dedalus, seizing his guest by the coat sleeve. Dante stared across the table, her cheeks shaking. Mr. Casey struggled up from his chair and bent across the table towards her, scraping the air from before his eyes with one hand as though he were tearing aside a cobweb. "No God for Ireland," he cried. "We have had too much God in Ireland. Away with God." "Blasphemer! Devil!" screamed Dante, starting to her feet and almost spitting in his face. Uncle Charles and Mr. Dedalus pulled Mr. Casey back into his chair again, talking to him from both sides reasonably. He stared before him out of his dark, flaming eyes, repeating, "Away with God, I say." Dante shoved her chair violently aside and left the table, upsetting her napkin ring, which rolled slowly along the carpet and came to rest against the foot of an easy-chair. Mrs. Dedalus rose quickly and followed her towards the door. At the door, Dante turned round violently and shouted down the room, her cheeks flushed and quivering with rage. "Devil out of hell! We won! We crushed him to death! Fiend!" The door slammed behind her. Mr. Casey, freeing his arms from his holders, suddenly bowed his head on his hands with a sob of pain. "Poor Parnell," he cried loudly. "My dead king." He sobbed loudly and bitterly. Stephen, raising his terror-stricken face, saw that his father's eyes were full of tears. The fellows talked together in little groups. One fellow said, "They were caught near the Hill of Lions." "Who caught them?" "Mr. Gleeson and the minister. They were on a car." The same fellow added, "A fellow in the higher line told me." Fleming asked, "But why did they run away? Tell us." "I know why," Cecil Thunder said. "Because they had fecked cash out of the rector's room." "Who fecked it?" "Kickham's brother. And they all went shares in it." "But that was stealing." How could they have done that? A fat lot you know about it, Thunder, Wells said. I know why they scut. Tell us why. I was told not to, Wells said. Oh, go on, Wells, all said. You might tell us. We won't let it out. Stephen bent forward his head to hear. Wells looked round to see if anyone was coming. Then he said secretly, You know the altar wine they keep in the press in the sacristy? Yes. Well, they drank that, and it was found out who did it by the smell. And that's why they ran away, if you want to know. And the fellow who had spoken first said, Yes, that's what I heard too from the fellow in the higher line. The fellows all were silent. Stephen stood among them, afraid to speak, listening. A faint sickness of awe made him feel weak. How could they have done that? He thought of the dark, silent sacristy. There were dark wooden presses there, where the crimped surplices lay quietly folded. It was not the chapel, but still you had to speak under your breath. It was a holy place. He remembered the summer evening he had been there to be dressed as boat-bearer, the evening of the procession to the little altar in the wood. A strange and holy place. The boy that held the censer had swung it gently to and fro near the door, with the silvery cap lifted by the middle chain to keep the coals lighting. That was called charcoal, and it had burned quietly as the fellow had swung it gently and had given off a weak, sour smell. And then, when all were vested, he had stood holding out the boat to the rector, and the rector had put a spoonful of incense in it, and it had hissed on the red coals. The fellows were talking together in little groups here and there on the playground. The fellows seemed to him to have grown smaller. That was because a sprinter had knocked him down the day before, a fellow out of second of grammar. He had been thrown by the fellow's machine lightly on the cinder path, and his spectacles had been broken in 3 pieces, and some of the grit of the cinders had gone into his mouth. That was why the fellows seemed to him smaller and farther away, and the goalposts so thin and far, and the soft grey sky so high up. But there was no play on the football grounds, for cricket was coming, and some said that Barnes would be prof, and some said it would be Flowers, and all over the playgrounds they were playing rounders and bowling twisters and lobs. And from here and from there came the sounds of the cricket bats through the soft grey air. They said, pick, pack, pock, puck, little drops of water in a fountain slowly falling in the brimming bowl. Athy, who had been silent, said quietly, You are all wrong. All turned towards him eagerly. Why? Do you know? Who told you? Tell us, Athy. Athy pointed across the playground to where Simon Moonan was walking by himself, kicking a stone before him. Ask him, he said. The fellows looked there and then said, Why him? Is he in it? Athy lowered his voice and said, Do you know why those fellows scut? I will tell you, but you must not let on you know. Tell us, Athy. Go on. You might if you know. He paused for a moment and then said mysteriously, They were caught with Simon Moonan and Tusker Boyle in the square one night. The fellows looked at him and asked, Caught? What doing? Athy said, Smugging. All the fellows were silent, and Athy said, And that's why. Stephen looked at the faces of the fellows, but they were all looking across the playground. He wanted to ask somebody about it. What did that mean about the smugging in the square? Why did the 5 fellows out of the higher line run away for that? It was a joke, he thought. Simon Moonan had nice clothes, and one night he had shown him a ball of creamy sweets that the fellows of the football 15 had rolled down to him along the carpet in the middle of the refectory when he was at the door. It was the night of the match against the Bective Rangers, and the ball was made just like a red and green apple, only it opened, and it was full of the creamy sweets. And one day Boyle had said that an elephant had 2 tuskers instead of 2 tusks, and that was why he was called Tusker Boyle, but some fellows called him Lady Boyle because he was always at his nails, paring them. Eileen had long, thin, cool white hands too, because she was a girl. They were like ivory, only soft. That was the meaning of Tower of Ivory, but Protestants could not understand it and made fun of it. One day he had stood beside her looking into the hotel grounds. A waiter was running up a trail of bunting on the flagstaff, and a fox terrier was scampering to and fro on the sunny lawn. She had put her hand into his pocket where his hand was, and he had felt how cool and thin and soft her hand was. She had said that pockets were funny things to have, and then all of a sudden she had broken away and had run laughing down the sloping curve of the path. Her fair hair had streamed out behind her like gold in the sun. Tower of ivory, house of gold. By thinking of things you could understand them. But why in the square? You went there when you wanted to do something. It was all thick slabs of slate, and water trickled all day out of tiny pinholes, and there was a queer smell of stale water there. And behind the door of one of the closets there was a drawing in red pencil of a bearded man in a Roman dress, with a brick in each hand, and underneath was the name of the drawing. Balbus was building a wall. Some fellow had drawn it there for a cod. It had a funny face, but it was very like a man with a beard. And on the wall of another closet there was written in backhand in beautiful writing, Julius Caesar wrote the Calico Belly. Perhaps that was why they were there, because it was a place where some fellows wrote things for cod. But all the same, it was queer what Athy said and the way he said it. It was not a cod because they had run away. He looked with the others across the playground and began to feel afraid. At last Fleming said, "And we are all to be punished for what other fellows did." "I won't come back, see if I do," Cecil Thunder said. 3 days' silence in the refectory, and sending us up for 6 and 8 every minute. "Yes," said Wells, "and old Barrett has a new way of twisting the note so that you can't open it and fold it again to see how many ferulae you are to get. I won't come back too." "Yes," said Cecil Thunder, and the prefect of studies was in second of grammar this morning. "Let us get up a rebellion," Fleming said. "Will we?" All the fellows were silent. The air was very silent, and you could hear the cricket bats, but more slowly than before. Pick, pock. Wells asked, "What is going to be done to them?" "Simon Moonan and Tusker are going to be flogged," Athy said, "and the fellows in the higher line got their choice of flogging or being expelled." "And which are they taking?" asked the fellow who had spoken first. "All are taking expulsion except Corrigan," Athy answered. "He's going to be flogged by Mr. Gleeson." "I know why," Cecil Thunder said. "He is right, and the other fellows are wrong, because a flogging wears off after a bit. But a fellow that has been expelled from college is known all his life on account of it. Besides, Gleeson won't flog him hard." "It's best of his play not to," Fleming said. "I wouldn't like to be Simon Moonan and Tusker," Cecil Thunder said, "but I don't believe they will be flogged. Perhaps they will be sent up for twice 9. "No, no," said Athy. "They'll both get it on the vital spot." Wells rubbed himself and said in a crying voice, "Please, sir, let me off." Athy grinned and turned up the sleeves of his jacket, saying, "It can't be helped. It must be done. So down with your breeches, and out with your bum." The fellows laughed, but he felt that they were a little afraid. In the silence of the soft grey air, he heard the cricket bats from here and from there. Pock. That was a sound to hear, but if you were hit, then you would feel a pain. The pandybat made a sound too, but not like that. The fellows said it was made of whalebone and leather with lead inside, and he wondered what was the pain like. There were different kinds of sounds. A long, thin cane would have a high whistling sound, and he wondered what was that pain like. It made him shivery to think of it, and cold, and what Athy said too. But what was there to laugh at in it? It made him shivery. But that was because you always felt like a shiver when you let down your trousers. It was the same in the bath when you undressed yourself. He wondered who had to let them down, the master or the boy himself. Oh, how could they laugh about it that way? He looked at Athy's rolled-up sleeves and knuckly, inky hands. He had rolled up his sleeves to show how Mr. Gleeson would roll up his sleeves. But Mr. Gleeson had round, shiny cuffs and clean white wrists and fattish white hands, and the nails of them were long and pointed. Perhaps he pared them too, like Lady Boyle, but they were terribly long and pointed nails. So long and cruel they were, though the white fattish hands were not cruel, but gentle. And though he trembled with cold and fright to think of the cruel long nails, and of the high whistling sound of the cane, and of the chill you felt at the end of your shirt when you undressed yourself, yet he felt a feeling of queer, quiet pleasure inside him to think of the white, fattish hands, clean and strong and gentle. And he thought of what Cecil Thunder had said, that Mr. Gleeson would not flog Corrigan hard, and Fleming had said he would not, because it was best of his play not to. But that was not why. A voice from far out on the playground cried, "All in!" And other voices cried, "All in, all in." During the writing lesson he sat with his arms folded, listening to the slow scraping of the pens. Mr. Harford went to and fro, making little signs in red pencil, and sometimes sitting beside the boy to show him how to hold his pen. He had tried to spell out the headline for himself, though he knew already what it was, for it was the last of the book. Zeal without prudence is like a ship adrift, but the lines of the letters were like fine invisible threads, and it was only by closing his right eye tight and staring out of the left eye that he could make out the full curves of the capital. But Mr. Harford was very decent and never got into a wax. All the other masters got into dreadful waxes. But why were they to suffer for what fellows in the higher line did? Wells had said that they had drunk some of the altar wine out of the press in the sacristy, and that it had been found out who had done it by the smell. Perhaps they had stolen a monstrance to run away with and sell it somewhere. That must have been a terrible sin, to go in there quietly at night, to open the dark press and steal the flashing gold thing into which God was put on the altar in the middle of flowers and candles at benediction, while the incense went up in clouds at both sides as the fellows swung the censer, and Dominic Kelly sang the first part by himself in the choir. But God was not in it, of course, when they stole it. But still it was a strange and a great sin even to touch it. He thought of it with deep awe, a terrible and strange sin. It thrilled him to think of it in the silence when the pens scraped lightly. But to drink the altar wine out of the press and be found out by the smell was a sin too. But it was not terrible and strange. It only made you feel a little sickish on account of the smell of the wine. Because on the day when he had made his first Holy Communion in the chapel, he had shut his eyes and opened his mouth and put out his tongue a little. And when the rector had stooped down to give him the Holy Communion, he had smelt a faint winey smell off the rector's breath after the wine of the Mass. The word was beautiful. Wine. It made you think of dark purple, because the grapes were dark purple that grew in Greece, outside houses like white temples. But the faint smell of the rector's breath had made him feel a sick feeling on the morning of his first communion. The day of your first communion was the happiest day of your life, and once a lot of generals had asked Napoleon what was the happiest day of his life. They thought he would say the day he won some great battle, or the day he was made an emperor. But he said, "Gentlemen, the happiest day of my life was the day on which I made my first Holy Communion." Father Arnold came in, and the Latin lesson began, and he remained still leaning on the desk with his arms folded. Father Arnold gave out the theme books, and he said that they were scandalous, and that they were all to be written out again with the corrections at once. But the worst of all was Fleming's theme, because the pages were stuck together by a blot, and Father Arnold held it up by a corner and said it was an insult to any master to send him up such a theme. Then he asked Jack Lawton to decline the noun mare, and Jack Lawton stopped at the ablative singular and could not go on with the plural. "You should be ashamed of yourself," said Father Arnold sternly. "You, the leader of the class." Then he asked the next boy, and the next, and the next. Nobody knew. Father Arnold became very quiet, more and more quiet, as each boy tried to answer it and could not. But his face was black-looking, and his eyes were staring, though his voice was so quiet. Then he asked Fleming, and Fleming said that the word had no plural. Father Arnold suddenly shut the book and shouted at him, "Kneel out there in the middle of the class. You are one of the idlest boys I ever met. Copy out your themes again, the rest of you." Fleming moved heavily out of his place and knelt between the two last benches. The other boys bent over their theme books and began to write. A silence filled the classroom, and Stephen, glancing timidly at Father Arnold's dark face, saw that it was a little red from the wax he was in. Was that a sin for Father Arnold to be in a wax, or was he allowed to get into a wax when the boys were idle because that made them study better, or was he only letting on to be in a wax? It was because he was allowed, because a priest would know what a sin was and would not do it. But if he did it one time by mistake, what would he do to go to confession? Perhaps he would go to confession to the minister, and if the minister did it, he would go to the rector, and the rector to the provincial, and the provincial to the general of the Jesuits. That was called the order, and he had heard his father say that they were all clever men. They could all have become high-up people in the world if they had not become Jesuits. And he wondered what Father Arnold and Paddy Barrett would have become, and what Mr. McGlade and Mr. Gleeson would have become if they had not become Jesuits. It was hard to think what, because you would have to think of them in a different way, with different coloured coats and trousers, and with beards and moustaches and different kinds of hats. The door opened quietly and closed. A quick whisper ran through the class. The prefect of studies. There was an instant of dead silence, and then the loud crack of a pandybat on the last desk. Stephen's heart leapt up in fear. "Any boys want flogging here, Father Arnold?" cried the prefect of studies. "Any lazy idle loafers that want flogging in this class?" He came to the middle of the class and saw Fleming on his knees. "Ho, ho!" he cried. "Who is this boy? Why is he on his knees? What is your name, boy?" "Fleming, sir." "Ho, ho! Fleming! An idler, of course. I can see it in your eye. Why is he on his knees, Father Arnold?" "He wrote a bad Latin theme," Father Arnold said, and he missed all the questions in grammar. "Of course he did," cried the prefect of studies. "Of course he did. A born idler. I can see it in the corner of his eye." He banged his pandybat down on the desk and cried, "Up, Fleming! Up, my boy!" Fleming stood up slowly. "Hold out!" cried the prefect of studies. Fleming held out his hand. The pandybat came down on it with a loud smacking sound. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Other hand! The pandybat came down again in 6 loud, quick smacks. "Kneel down!" cried the prefect of studies. Fleming knelt down, squeezing his hands under his armpits, his face contorted with pain. But Stephen knew how hard his hands were because Fleming was always rubbing rosin into them. But perhaps he was in great pain, for the noise of the pandybat was terrible. Stephen's heart was beating and fluttering. "At your work, all of you," shouted the prefect of studies. "We want no lazy idle loafers here, lazy idle little schemers. At your work, I tell you. Father Dolan will be in to see you every day. Father Dolan will be in tomorrow." He poked one of the boys in the side with his pandybat, saying, "You, boy, when will Father Dolan be in again?" "Tomorrow, sir," said Tom Furlong's voice. "Tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow," said the prefect of studies. "Make up your minds for that. Every day, Father Dolan. Right away. You, boy, who are you?" Stephen's heart jumped suddenly. "Daedalus, sir. Why are you not writing like the others?" My... He could not speak with fright. "Why is he not writing, Father Arnold?" "He broke his glasses," said Father Arnold, "and I exempted him from work." "Broke? What is this I hear? What is this?" "Your name is," said the prefect of studies. "Daedalus, sir." "Out here, Daedalus? Lazy little schemer. I see schemer in your face. Where did you break your glasses?" Stephen stumbled into the middle of the class, blinded by fear and haste. "Where did you break your glasses?" repeated the prefect of studies. "The cinder path, sir." "Ho, ho! The cinder path!" cried the prefect of studies. "I know that trick." Stephen lifted his eyes in wonder and saw for a moment Father Dolan's white-grey, not young face, his baldy white-grey head with fluff at the sides of it, the steel rims of his spectacles and his no-coloured eyes looking through the glasses. Why did he say he knew that trick? "Lazy, idle little loafer," cried the prefect of studies. "Broke my glasses, an old schoolboy trick. Out with your hand this moment." Stephen closed his eyes and held out in the air his trembling hand with the palm upwards. He felt the prefect of studies touch it for a moment at the fingers to straighten it, and then the swish of the sleeve of the soutane as the pandybat was lifted to strike. A hot, burning, stinging, tingling blow, like the loud crack of a broken stick, made his trembling hand crumple together like a leaf in the fire. And at the sound and the pain, scalding tears were driven into his eyes. His whole body was shaking with fright. His arm was shaking, and his crumpled, burning, livid hand shook like a loose leaf in the air. A cry sprang to his lips, a prayer to be let off. But though the tears scalded his eyes and his limbs quivered with pain and fright, he held back the hot tears and the cry that scalded his throat. "Other hand!" shouted the prefect of studies. Stephen drew back his maimed and quivering right arm and held out his left hand. The soutane sleeve swished again as the pandybat was lifted, and a loud crashing sound and a fierce, maddening, tingling, burning pain made his hand shrink together, with the palms and fingers in a livid, quivering mass. The scalding water burst forth from his eyes, and burning with shame and agony and fear, he drew back his shaking arm in terror and burst out into a whine of pain. His body shook with a palsy of fright, and in shame and rage he felt the scalding cry come from his throat and the scalding tears falling out of his eyes and down his flaming cheeks. "Kneel down!" cried the prefect of studies. Stephen knelt down quickly, pressing his beaten hands to his sides. To think of them beaten and swollen with pain all in a moment made him feel so sorry for them, as if they were not his own, but someone else's that he felt sorry for. And as he knelt, calming the last sobs in his throat and feeling the burning, tingling pain pressed into his sides, he thought of the hands which he had held out in the air with the palms up, and of the firm touch of the prefect of studies when he had steadied the shaking fingers, and of the beaten, swollen, reddened mass of palm and fingers that shook helplessly in the air. "Get at your work, all of you," cried the prefect of studies from the door. "Father Dolan will be in every day to see if any boy, any lazy, idle little loafer wants flogging. Every day, every day." The door closed behind him. The hushed class continued to copy out the themes. Father Arnold rose from his seat and went among them, helping the boys with gentle words and telling them the mistakes they had made. His voice was very gentle and soft. Then he returned to his seat and said to Fleming and Stephen, "You may return to your places, you two." Fleming and Stephen rose and, walking to their seats, sat down. Stephen, scarlet with shame, opened a book quickly with one weak hand and bent down upon it, his face close to the page. It was unfair and cruel because the doctor had told him not to read without glasses, and he had written home to his father that morning to send him a new pair. And Father Arnold had said that he need not study till the new glasses came. Then to be called a schemer before the class, and to be pandied when he always got the card for first or second and was the leader of the Yorkists. How could the prefect of studies know that it was a trick? He felt the touch of the prefect's fingers as they had steadied his hand, and at first he had thought he was going to shake hands with him because the fingers were soft and firm. But then, in an instant, he had heard the swish of the soutane sleeve and the crash. It was cruel and unfair to make him kneel in the middle of the class then, and Father Arnold had told them both that they might return to their places without making any difference between them. He listened to Father Arnold's low and gentle voice as he corrected the themes. Perhaps he was sorry now and wanted to be decent, but it was unfair and cruel. The prefect of studies was a priest, but that was cruel and unfair. And his white-grey face and the no-coloured eyes behind the steel-rimmed spectacles were cruel-looking because he had steadied the hand first with his firm, soft fingers, and that was to hit it better and louder. "It's a stinking mean thing. That's what it is," said Fleming in the corridor as the classes were passing out in file to the refectory, "to pandy a fellow for what is not his fault." "You really broke your glasses by accident, didn't you?" Nasty Roche asked. Stephen felt his heart filled by Fleming's words and did not answer. "Of course he did," said Fleming. "I wouldn't stand it. I'd go up and tell the rector on him." "Yes," said Cecil Thunder eagerly, "and I saw him lift the pandybat over his shoulder, and he's not allowed to do that." "Did they hurt you much?" Nasty Roche asked. "Very much," Stephen said. I wouldn't stand it, Fleming repeated, from Baldyhead or any other Baldyhead. It's a stinking mean low trick, that's what it is. I'd go straight up to the rector and tell him about it after dinner. Yes, do. Yes, do, said Cecil Thunder. Yes, do. Yes, go up and tell the rector on him, Daedalus, said Nasty Roche, because he said that he'd come in tomorrow again and pandy you. Yes, yes, tell the rector, all said. And there were some fellows out of second of grammar listening, and one of them said, the Senate and the Roman people declared that Daedalus had been wrongly punished. It was wrong, it was unfair and cruel, and, as he sat in the refectory, he suffered time after time, in memory the same humiliation, until he began to wonder whether it might not really be that there was something in his face which made him look like a schemer, and he wished he had a little mirror to see. But there could not be, and it was unjust and cruel and unfair. He could not eat the blackish fish fritters they got on Wednesdays in Lent, and one of his potatoes had the mark of the spade in it. Yes, he would do what the fellows had told him. He would go up and tell the rector that he had been wrongly punished. A thing like that had been done before by somebody in history, by some great person whose head was in the books of history, and the rector would declare that he had been wrongly punished because the Senate and the Roman people always declared that the men who did that had been wrongly punished. Those were the great men whose names were in Richmal Magnall's questions. History was all about those men and what they did. And that was what Peter Parley's tales about Greece and Rome were all about. Peter Parley himself was on the first page in a picture. There was a road over a heath with grass at the side and little bushes, and Peter Parley had a broad hat like a Protestant minister and a big stick, and he was walking fast along the road to Greece and Rome. It was easy what he had to do. All he had to do was when the dinner was over, and he came out in his turn to go on walking, but not out to the corridor, but up the staircase on the right that led to the castle. He had nothing to do but that, to turn to the right and walk fast up the staircase, and in half a minute he would be in the low, dark, narrow corridor that led through the castle to the rector's room. And every fellow had said that it was unfair, even the fellow out of second of grammar who had said that about the Senate and the Roman people. What would happen? He heard the fellows of the higher line stand up at the top of the refectory and heard their steps as they came down the matting. Paddy Rath and Jimmy Magee and the Spaniard and the Portuguese, and the fifth was Big Corrigan, who was going to be flogged by Mr. Gleeson. That was why the prefect of studies had called him a schemer and pandied him for nothing. And straining his weak eyes, tired with the tears, he watched Big Corrigan's broad shoulders and big hanging black head passing in the file. But he had done something, and besides, Mr. Gleeson would not flog him hard, and he remembered how Big Corrigan looked in the bath. He had skin the same colour as the turf-coloured bog water in the shallow end of the bath, and when he walked along the side his feet slapped loudly on the wet tiles, and at every step his thighs shook a little because he was fat. The refectory was half empty, and the fellows were still passing out in file. He could go up the staircase because there was never a priest or a prefect outside the refectory door, but he could not go. The rector would side with the prefect of studies and think it was a schoolboy trick, and then the prefect of studies would come in every day the same, only it would be worse because he would be dreadfully waxy at any fellow going up to the rector about him. The fellows had told him to go, but they would not go themselves. They had forgotten all about it. No, it was best to forget all about it, and perhaps the prefect of studies had only said he would come in. No, it was best to hide out of the way, because when you were small and young, you could often escape that way. The fellows at his table stood up. He stood up and passed out among them in the file. He had to decide. He was coming near the door. If he went on with the fellows, he could never go up to the rector because he could not leave the playground for that. And if he went and was pandied all the same, all the fellows would make fun and talk about young Daedalus going up to the rector to tell on the prefect of studies. He was walking down along the matting, and he saw the door before him. It was impossible. He could not. He thought of the baldy head of the prefect of studies with the cruel, no-coloured eyes looking at him, and he heard the voice of the prefect of studies asking him twice what his name was. Why could he not remember the name when he was told the first time? Was he not listening the first time, or was it to make fun out of the name? The great men in the history had names like that, and nobody made fun of them. It was his own name that he should have made fun of if he wanted to make fun. Dolan. It was like the name of a woman who washed clothes. He had reached the door, and turning quickly up to the right, walked up the stairs, and before he could make up his mind to come back, he had entered the low, dark, narrow corridor that led to the castle. And as he crossed the threshold of the door of the corridor, he saw, without turning his head to look, that all the fellows were looking after him as they went filing by. He passed along the narrow, dark corridor, passing little doors that were the doors of the rooms of the community. He peered in front of him, and right and left, through the gloom, and thought that those must be portraits. It was dark and silent, and his eyes were weak and tired with tears, so that he could not see. But he thought they were the portraits of the saints and great men of the order who were looking down on him silently as he passed. Saint Ignatius Loyola, holding an open book and pointing to the words Ad Majorem Dei Gloriam in it. St. Francis Xavier pointing to his chest. Lorenzo Ricci with his beretta on his head like one of the prefects of the lines. The three patrons of holy youth, St. Stanislaus Kostka, St. Aloysius Gonzago, and Blessed John Berchmans, all with young faces, because they died when they were young, and Father Peter Kenny, sitting in a chair wrapped in a big cloak. He came out on the landing above the entrance hall and looked about him. That was where Hamilton Rowan had passed, and the marks of the soldiers' slugs were there. And it was there that the old servants had seen the ghost in the white cloak of a marshal. An old servant was sweeping at the end of the landing. He asked him where was the rector's room, and the old servant pointed to the door at the far end and looked after him as he went on to it and knocked. There was no answer. He knocked again more loudly, and his heart jumped when he heard a muffled voice say, "Come in." He turned the handle and opened the door and fumbled for the handle of the green baize door inside. He found it and pushed it open and went in. He saw the rector sitting at a desk writing. There was a skull on the desk and a strange solemn smell in the room, like the old leather of chairs. His heart was beating fast on account of the solemn place he was in and the silence of the room, and he looked at the skull and at the rector's kind-looking face. "Well, my little man," said the rector, "what is it?" Stephen swallowed down the thing in his throat and said, "I broke my glasses, sir." The rector opened his mouth and said, "Oh!" Then he smiled and said, "Well, if we broke our glasses, we must write home for a new pair." "I wrote home, sir," said Stephen, "and Father Arnold said I am not to study till they come." "Quite right," said the rector. Stephen swallowed down the thing again and tried to keep his legs and his voice from shaking. "But, sir—" "Yes?" "Father Dolan came in today and pandied me because I was not writing my theme." The rector looked at him in silence, and he could feel the blood rising to his face and the tears about to rise to his eyes. The rector said, "Your name is Daedalus, isn't it?" "Yes, sir." "And where did you break your glasses?" "On the cinder path, sir. A fellow was coming out of the bicycle house, and I fell, and they got broken. I don't know the fellow's name." The rector looked at him again in silence. Then he smiled and said, "Oh, well, it was a mistake. I am sure Father Dolan did not know. But I told him I broke them, sir, and he pandied me." "Did you tell him that you had written home for a new pair?" the rector asked. "No, sir." "Oh, well then," said the rector. "Father Dolan did not understand. You can say that I excuse you from your lessons for a few days." Stephen said quickly, for fear his trembling would prevent him, "Yes, sir, but Father Dolan said he will come in tomorrow to pandy me again for it." "Very well," the rector said. "It is a mistake, and I shall speak to Father Dolan myself. Will that do now?" Stephen felt the tears wetting his eyes and murmured, "Oh, yes, sir. Thanks." The rector held his hand across the side of the desk where the skull was, and Stephen, placing his hand in it for a moment, felt a cool, moist palm. "Good day now," said the rector, withdrawing his hand and bowing. "Good day, sir," said Stephen. He bowed and walked quietly out of the room, closing the doors carefully and slowly. But when he had passed the old servant on the landing and was again in the low, narrow, dark corridor, he began to walk faster and faster. Faster and faster, he hurried on through the gloom excitedly. He bumped his elbow against the door at the end, and hurrying down the staircase, walked quickly through the 2 corridors and out into the air. He could hear the cries of the fellows on the playgrounds. He broke into a run, and running quicker and quicker, ran across the cinder path and reached the 3rd-line playground, panting. The fellows had seen him running. They closed round him in a ring, pushing one against another to hear. "Tell us! Tell us!" What did he say? "Did you go in?" What did he say? "Tell us! Tell us!" He told them what he had said and what the rector had said, and when he had told them, all the fellows flung their caps, spinning up into the air, and cried, "Hurroo!" They caught their caps and sent them up again, spinning sky high, and cried again, "Hurroo! Hurroo!" They made a cradle of their locked hands and hoisted him up among them and carried him along till he struggled to get free. And when he had escaped from them, they broke away in all directions, flinging their caps again into the air and whistling as they went, spinning up and crying, "Hurroo!" And they gave 3 groans for Baldyhead Dolan and 3 cheers for Conmee, and they said he was the decentest rector that was ever in Clongowes. The cheers died away in the soft grey air. He was alone. He was happy and free. But he would not be any way proud with Father Dolan. He would be very quiet and obedient, and he wished that he could do something kind for him to show him that he was not proud. The air was soft and grey and mild, and evening was coming. There was the smell of evening in the air, the smell of the fields in the country where they digged up turnips to peel them and eat them when they went out for a walk to Major Barton's, the smell there was in the little wood beyond the pavilion where the gallnuts were. The fellows were practising long shies and bowling lobs and slow twisters. In the soft grey silence he could hear the bump of the balls, and from here and from there, through the quiet air, the sound of the cricket bats. Pick, pack, pock, puck, like drops of water in a fountain falling softly in the brimming bowl. Chapter 2. Uncle Charles smoked such black twist that at last his nephew suggested to him to enjoy his morning smoke in a little outhouse at the end of the garden. "Very good, Simon. All serene, Simon," said the old man tranquilly. "Anywhere you like. The outhouse will do me nicely. It will be more salubrious." "Damn me," said Mr. Dedalus frankly, "if I know how you can smoke such villainous, awful tobacco. It's like gunpowder, by God." "It's very nice, Simon," replied the old man, "very cool and mollifying." Every morning, therefore, Uncle Charles repaired to his outhouse, but not before he had greased and brushed scrupulously his back hair and brushed and put on his tall hat. While he smoked, the brim of his tall hat and the bowl of his pipe were just visible beyond the jambs of the outhouse door. His arbour, as he called the reeking outhouse, which he shared with the cat and the garden tools, served him also as a sounding box, and every morning he hummed contentedly one of his favourite songs, "Oh, twine me a bower," or "Blue eyes and golden hair," or "The groves of Blarney," while the grey and blue coils of smoke rose slowly from his pipe and vanished in the pure air. During the first part of the summer in Blackrock, Uncle Charles was Stephen's constant companion. Uncle Charles was a hale old man with a well-tanned skin, rugged features and white side whiskers. On weekdays he did messages between the house in Carrisfort Avenue and those shops in the main street of the town with which the family dealt. Stephen was glad to go with him on these errands, for Uncle Charles helped him very liberally to handfuls of whatever was exposed in open boxes and barrels outside the counter. He would seize a handful of grapes and sawdust, or 3 or 4 American apples, and thrust them generously into his grandnephew's hand, while the shopman smiled uneasily, and, on Stephen's feigning reluctance to take them, he would frown and say, "Take them, sir. Do you hear me, sir? They're good for your bowels." When the order list had been booked, the two would go on to the park, where an old friend of Stephen's father, Mike Flynn, would be found seated on a bench waiting for them. Then would begin Stephen's run round the park. Mike Flynn would stand at the gate near the railway station, watch in hand, while Stephen ran round the track in the style Mike Flynn favoured, his head high lifted, his knees well lifted, and his hands held straight down by his sides. When the morning practice was over, the trainer would make his comments and sometimes illustrate them by shuffling along for a yard or so, comically in an old pair of blue canvas shoes. A small ring of wonder-struck children and nursemaids would gather to watch him and linger, even when he and Uncle Charles had sat down again and were talking athletics and politics. Though he had heard his father say that Mike Flynn had put some of the best runners of modern times through his hands, Stephen often glanced at his trainer's flabby, stubble-covered face as it bent over the long, stained fingers through which he rolled his cigarette, and with pity at the mild, lustreless blue eyes which would look up suddenly from the task and gaze vaguely into the blue distance while the long, swollen fingers ceased their rolling and grains and fibres of tobacco fell back into the pouch. On the way home, Uncle Charles would often pay a visit to the chapel, and as the font was above Stephen's reach, the old man would dip his hand and then sprinkle the water briskly about Stephen's clothes and on the floor of the porch. While he prayed, he knelt on his red handkerchief and read above his breath from a thumb-blackened prayer book wherein catchwords were printed at the foot of every page. Stephen knelt at his side, respecting, though he did not share, his piety. He often wondered what his granduncle prayed for so seriously. Perhaps he prayed for the souls in purgatory, or for the grace of a happy death, or perhaps he prayed that God might send him back a part of the big fortune he had squandered in Cork. On Sundays, Stephen, with his father and his granduncle, took their constitutional. The old man was a nimble walker in spite of his corns, and often 10 or 12 miles of the road were covered. The little village of Stillorgan was the parting of the ways. Either they went to the left towards the Dublin mountains, or along the Goatstown road, and thence into Dundrum, coming home by Sandyford. Trudging along the road, or standing in some grimy wayside public house, his elders spoke constantly of the subjects nearer their hearts, of Irish politics, of Munster, and of the legends of their own family, to all of which Stephen lent an avid ear. Words which he did not understand, he said over and over to himself till he had learnt them by heart, and through them he had glimpses of the real world about them. The hour when he too would take part in the life of that world seemed drawing near, and in secret he began to make ready for the great part which he felt awaited him, the nature of which he only dimly apprehended. His evenings were his own, and he pored over a ragged translation of The Count of Monte Cristo. The figure of that dark avenger stood forth in his mind for whatever he had heard or divined in childhood of the strange and terrible. At night he built up on the parlour table an image of the wonderful island cave out of transfers and paper flowers and coloured tissue paper and strips of the silver and golden paper in which chocolate is wrapped. When he had broken up this scenery, weary of its tinsel, there would come to his mind the bright picture of Marseille, of sunny trellises, and of Mercedes. Outside Blackrock, on the road that led to the mountains, stood a small whitewashed house, in the garden of which grew many rose bushes. And in this house, he told himself, another Mercedes lived. Both on the outward and on the homeward journey, he measured distance by this landmark. And in his imagination he lived through a long train of adventures, marvellous as those in the book itself, towards the close of which there appeared an image of himself, grown older and sadder, standing in a moonlit garden with Mercedes, who had so many years before slighted his love, and with a sadly proud gesture of refusal, saying, "Madam, I never eat muscatel grapes." He became the ally of a boy named Aubrey Mills and founded with him a gang of adventurers in the avenue. Aubrey carried a whistle dangling from his buttonhole and a bicycle lamp attached to his belt, while the others had short sticks thrust daggerwise through theirs. Stephen, who had read of Napoleon's plain style of dress, chose to remain unadorned and thereby heightened for himself the pleasure of taking counsel with his lieutenant before giving orders. The gang made forays into the gardens of old maids, or went down to the castle and fought a battle on the shaggy, weed-grown rocks, coming home after it weary stragglers with the stale odours of the foreshore in their nostrils and the rank oils of the sea-wrack upon their hands and in their hair. Aubrey and Stephen had a common milkman, and often they drove out in the milk car to Carrick Mines, where the cows were at grass. While the men were milking, the boys would take turns in riding the tractable mare round the field. But when autumn came, the cows were driven home from the grass, and the first sight of the filthy cowyard at Stradbrook, with its foul green puddles and clots of liquid dung and steaming bran troughs, sickened Stephen's heart. The cattle, which had seemed so beautiful in the country on sunny days, revolted him, and he could not even look at the milk they yielded. The coming of September did not trouble him this year, for he was not to be sent back to Clongowes. The practice in the park came to an end when Mike Flynn went into hospital. Aubrey was at school and had only an hour or two free in the evening. The gang fell asunder, and there were no more nightly forays or battles on the rocks. Stephen sometimes went round with the car which delivered the evening milk, and these chilly drives blew away his memory of the filth of the cowyard, and he felt no repugnance at seeing the cow hairs and hayseeds on the milkman's coat. Whenever the car drew up before a house, he waited to catch a glimpse of a well-scrubbed kitchen or of a softly lighted hall, and to see how the servant would hold the jug and how she would close the door. He thought it should be a pleasant life enough, driving along the roads every evening to deliver milk, if he had warm gloves and a fat bag of ginger nuts in his pocket to eat from. But the same foreknowledge which had sickened his heart and made his legs sag suddenly as he raced round the park, the same intuition which had made him glance with mistrust at his trainer's flabby, stubble-covered face as it bent heavily over his long, stained fingers, dissipated any vision of the future. In a vague way, he understood that his father was in trouble, and that this was the reason why he himself had not been sent back to Clongowes. For some time he had felt the slight change in his house, and those changes in what he had deemed unchangeable were so many slight shocks to his boyish conception of the world. The ambition which he felt astir at times in the darkness of his soul sought no outlet. A dusk like that of the outer world obscured his mind, as he heard the mare's hoofs clattering along the tram track on the rock road, and the great cans swaying and rattling behind him. He returned to Mercedes, and, as he brooded upon her image, a strange unrest crept into his blood. Sometimes a fever gathered within him, and led him to rove alone in the evening along the quiet avenue. The peace of the gardens and the kindly lights in the windows poured a tender influence into his restless heart. The noise of children at play annoyed him, and their silly voices made him feel, even more keenly than he had felt at Clongowes, that he was different from others. He did not want to play. He wanted to meet in the real world the unsubstantial image which his soul so constantly beheld. He did not know where to seek it or how, but a premonition which led him on told him that this image would, without any overt act of his, encounter him. They would meet quietly, as if they had known each other and had made their tryst, perhaps at one of the gates or in some more secret place. They would be alone, surrounded by darkness and silence, and in that moment of supreme tenderness he would be transfigured. He would fade into something impalpable under her eyes, and then in a moment he would be transfigured. Weakness and timidity and inexperience would fall from him in that magic moment. Two great yellow caravans had halted one morning before the door, and men had come tramping into the house to dismantle it. The furniture had been hustled out through the front garden, which was strewn with wisps of straw and rope ends, and into the huge vans at the gate. When all had been safely stowed, the vans had set off noisily down the avenue, and from the window of the railway carriage, in which he had sat with his red-eyed mother, Stephen had seen them lumbering along the Merrion Road. The parlour fire would not draw that evening, and Mr. Dedalus rested the poker against the bars of the grate to attract the flame. Uncle Charles dozed in a corner of the half-furnished, uncarpeted room, and near him the family portraits leaned against the wall. The lamp on the table shed a weak light over the boarded floor, muddied by the feet of the vanman. Stephen sat on a footstool beside his father, listening to a long and incoherent monologue. He understood little or nothing of it at first, but he became slowly aware that his father had enemies and that some fight was going to take place. He felt, too, that he was being enlisted for the fight, that some duty was being laid upon his shoulders. The sudden flight from the comfort and reverie of Blackrock, the passage through the gloomy, foggy city, the thought of the bare, cheerless house in which they were now to live, made his heart heavy. And again an intuition, a foreknowledge of the future came to him. He understood also why the servants had often whispered together in the hall, and why his father had often stood on the hearthrug with his back to the fire, talking loudly to Uncle Charles, who urged him to sit down and eat his dinner. "There's a crack of the whip left in me yet, Stephen, old chap," said Mr. Dedalus, poking at the dull fire with fierce energy. "We're not dead yet, sonny. No, by the Lord Jesus, God forgive me, nor half dead." Dublin was a new and complex sensation. Uncle Charles had grown so witless that he could no longer be sent out on errands, and the disorder in settling in the new house left Stephen freer than he had been in Blackrock. In the beginning he contented himself with circling timidly round the neighbouring square, or, at most, going halfway down one of the side streets, but when he had made a skeleton map of the city in his mind, he followed boldly one of its central lines until he reached the custom house. He passed unchallenged among the docks and along the quays, wondering at the multitude of corks that lay bobbing on the surface of the water in a thick yellow scum, at the crowds of quay porters and the rumbling carts and the ill-dressed bearded policemen. The vastness and strangeness of the life, suggested to him by the bales of merchandise stocked along the walls or swung aloft out of the holds of steamers, wakened again in him the unrest which had sent him wandering in the evening from garden to garden in search of Mercedes. And amid this new bustling life he might have fancied himself in another Marseille, but that he missed the bright sky and the sun-warmed trellises of the wine-shops. A vague dissatisfaction grew up within him as he looked on the quays and on the river and on the lowering skies, and yet he continued to wander up and down day after day as if he really sought someone that eluded him. He went once or twice with his mother to visit their relatives, and though they passed a jovial array of shops lit up and adorned for Christmas, his mood of embittered silence did not leave him. The causes of his embitterment were many, remote and near. He was angry with himself for being young and the prey of restless, foolish impulses, angry also with the change of fortune which was reshaping the world about him into a vision of squalor and insincerity. Yet his anger lent nothing to the vision. He chronicled with patience what he saw, detaching himself from it and tasting its mortifying flavour in secret. He was sitting on the backless chair in his aunt's kitchen. A lamp with a reflector hung on the japanned wall of the fireplace, and by its light his aunt was reading the evening paper that lay on her knees. She looked a long time at a smiling picture that was set in it, and said musingly, "The beautiful Mabel Hunter." A ringletted girl stood on tiptoe to peer at the picture, and said softly, "What is she in, Mud?" "In a pantomime, love." The child leaned her ringletted head against her mother's sleeve, gazing on the picture, and murmured as if fascinated, "The beautiful Mabel Hunter." As if fascinated, her eyes rested long upon those demurely taunting eyes, and she murmured devotedly, "Isn't she an exquisite creature?" And the boy who came in from the street, stamping crookedly under his stone of coal, heard her words. He dropped his load promptly on the floor and hurried to her side to see. He mauled the edges of the paper with his reddened and blackened hands, shouldering her aside and complaining that he could not see. He was sitting in the narrow breakfast room high up in the old dark windowed house. The firelight flickered on the wall, and beyond the window a spectral dusk was gathering upon the river. Before the fire, an old woman was busy making tea, and, as she bustled at the task, she told in a low voice of what the priest and the doctor had said. She told, too, of certain changes they had seen in her of late, and of her odd ways and sayings. He sat listening to the words and following the ways of adventure that lay open in the coals, arches and vaults, and winding galleries and jagged caverns. Suddenly he became aware of something in the doorway. A skull appeared suspended in the gloom of the doorway. A feeble creature like a monkey was there, drawn thither by the sound of voices at the fire. A whining voice came from the door, asking, "Is that Josephine?" The old bustling woman answered cheerily from the fireplace, "No, Ellen, it's Stephen." "Oh, oh, good evening, Stephen." He answered the greeting and saw a silly smile break over the face in the doorway. "Do you want anything, Ellen?" asked the old woman at the fire. But she did not answer the question and said, "I thought it was Josephine. I thought you were Josephine, Stephen." And, repeating this several times, she fell to laughing feebly. He was sitting in the midst of a children's party at Harold's Cross. His silent, watchful manner had grown upon him, and he took little part in the games. The children, wearing the spoils of their crackers, danced and romped noisily, and, though he tried to share their merriment, he felt himself a gloomy figure amid the gay cocked hats and sunbonnets. But when he had sung his song and withdrawn into a snug corner of the room, he began to taste the joy of his loneliness. The mirth, which in the beginning of the evening had seemed to him false and trivial, was like a soothing air to him, passing gaily by his senses, hiding from other eyes the feverish agitation of his blood, while through the circling of the dancers and amid the music and laughter. Her glance travelled to his corner, flattering, taunting, searching, exciting his heart. In the hall, the children who had stayed latest were putting on their things. The party was over. She had thrown a shawl about her, and as they went together towards the tram, sprays of her fresh, warm breath flew gaily above her cowled head, and her shoes tapped blithely on the glassy road. It was the last tram. The lank brown horses knew it and shook their bells to the clear night in admonition. The conductor talked with the driver, both nodding often in the green light of the lamp. On the empty seats of the tram were scattered a few coloured tickets. No sound of footsteps came up or down the road. No sound broke the peace of the night, save when the lank brown horses rubbed their noses together and shook their bells. They seemed to listen, he on the upper step and she on the lower. She came up to his step many times, and went down to hers again between their phrases, and once or twice stood close beside him for some moments on the upper step, forgetting to go down, and then went down. His heart danced upon her movements like a cork upon a tide. He heard what her eyes said to him from beneath their cowl, and knew that in some dim past, whether in life or reverie, he had heard their tale before. He saw her urge her vanities, her fine dress and sash and long black stockings, and knew that he had yielded to them 1,000 times. Yet a voice within him spoke above the noise of his dancing heart, asking him would he take her gift to which he had only to stretch out his hand. And he remembered the day when he and Eileen had stood looking into the hotel grounds, watching the waiters running up a trail of bunting on the flagstaff and the fox terrier scampering to and fro on the sunny lawn, and how, all of a sudden, she had broken out into a peal of laughter and had run down the sloping curve of the path. Now, as then, he stood listlessly in his place, seemingly a tranquil watcher of the scene before him. She too wants me to catch hold of her, he thought. That's why she came with me to the tram. I could easily catch hold of her when she comes up to my step. Nobody is looking. I could hold her and kiss her. But he did neither, and, when he was sitting alone in the deserted tram, he tore his ticket into shreds and stared gloomily at the corrugated footboard. The next day he sat at his table in the bare upper room for many hours. Before him lay a new pen, a new bottle of ink, and a new emerald exercise. From force of habit, he had written at the top of the first page the initial letters of the Jesuit motto, A.M.D.G. On the first line of the page appeared the title of the verses he was trying to write, to E. C. He knew it was right to begin so, for he had seen similar titles in the collected poems of Lord Byron. When he had written this title and drawn an ornamental line underneath, he fell into a daydream and began to draw diagrams on the cover of the book. He saw himself sitting at his table in Bray the morning after the discussion at the Christmas dinner table, trying to write a poem about Parnell on the back of one of his father's second moiety notices. But his brain had then refused to grapple with the theme, and desisting, he had covered the page with the names and addresses of certain of his classmates. Roderick Kickham, John Lawton, Anthony McSwiney, Simon Moonan. Now it seemed as if he would fail again, but by dint of brooding on the incident, he thought himself into confidence. During this process, all those elements which he deemed common and insignificant fell out of the scene. There remained no trace of the tram itself, nor of the tramman, nor of the horses, nor did he and she appear vividly. The verses told only of the night and the balmy breeze and the maiden lustre of the moon. Some undefined sorrow was hidden in the hearts of the protagonists as they stood in silence beneath the leafless trees, and when the moment of farewell had come, the kiss, which had been withheld by one, was given by both. After this, the letters LDS were written at the foot of the page, and, having hidden the book, he went into his mother's bedroom and gazed at his face for a long time in the mirror of her dressing table. But his long spell of leisure and liberty was drawing to its end. One evening his father came home full of news which kept his tongue busy all through dinner. Stephen had been awaiting his father's return, for there had been mutton hash that day, and he knew that his father would make him dip his bread in the gravy. But he did not relish the hash, for the mention of clongowes had coated his palate with a scum of disgust. "I walked bang into him," said Mr. Dedalus for the fourth time, just at the corner of the square. "Then I suppose," said Mrs. Dedalus, "he will be able to arrange it. I mean about Belvedere." "Of course he will," said Mr. Dedalus. "Don't I tell you he's provincial of the order now?" "I never liked the idea of sending him to the Christian Brothers myself," said Mrs. Dedalus. "Christian Brothers be damned," said Mr. Dedalus. "Is it with Paddy Stink and Mickey Mudd? No, let him stick to the Jesuits in God's name, since he began with them. They'll be of service to him in after years. Those are the fellows that can get you a position. And they're a very rich order, aren't they, Simon?" "Rather. They live well, I tell you. You saw their table at Clongowes. Fed up, by God, like gamecocks." Mr. Dedalus pushed his plate over to Stephen and bade him finish what was on it. "Now then, Stephen," he said, "you must put your shoulder to the wheel, old chap. You've had a fine long holiday." "Oh, I'm sure he'll work very hard now," said Mrs. Dedalus, "especially when he has Maurice with him." "Oh, holy Paul, I forgot about Morris," said Mr. Dedalus. "Here, Morris. Come here, you thick-headed ruffian. Do you know I'm going to send you to a college where they'll teach you to spell sea-a-tea-cat, and I'll buy you a nice little penny handkerchief to keep your nose dry. Won't that be grand fun?" Morris grinned at his father and then at his brother. Mr. Dedalus screwed his glass into his eye and stared hard at both his sons. Stephen mumbled his bread without answering his father's gaze. "By the by," said Mr. Dedalus at length, "the rector, or provincial rather, was telling me that story about you and Father Dolan. You're an impudent thief," he said. "Oh, he didn't, Simon." "Not he," said Mr. Dedalus, "but he gave me a great account of the whole affair. We were chatting, you know, and one word borrowed another. And by the way, who do you think he told me will get that job in the corporation? But I'll tell you that after. Well, as I was saying, we were chatting away quite friendly, and he asked me, did our friend here wear glasses still? And then he told me the whole story." "And was he annoyed, Simon?" "Annoyed? Not he. Manly little chap," he said. Mr. Dedalus imitated the mincing nasal tone of the provincial. "Father Dolan and I, when I told them all at dinner about it, Father Dolan and I had a great laugh over it. 'You better mind yourself, Father Dolan,' said I, 'or young Dedalus will send you up for twice 9. We had a famous laugh together over it. Ha, 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 ha!" Mr. Dedalus turned to his wife and interjected in his natural voice, "Shows you the spirit in which they take the boys there. Oh, a Jesuit for your life, for diplomacy." He reassumed the provincial's voice and repeated, "I told them all at dinner about it, and Father Dolan and I and all of us, we had a hearty laugh together over it. Ha, ha, ha!" The night of the Whitsuntide play had come, and Stephen from the window of the dressing-room looked out on the small grass plot across which lines of Chinese lanterns were stretched. He watched the visitors come down the steps from the house and pass into the theatre. Stewards in evening dress, old Belvedereans, loitered in groups about the entrance to the theatre and ushered in the visitors with ceremony. Under the sudden glow of a lantern, he could recognize the smiling face of a priest. The Blessed Sacrament had been removed from the tabernacle, and the first benches had been driven back so as to leave the dais of the altar and the space before it free. Against the wall stood companies of barbells and Indian clubs. The dumbbells were piled in one corner, and in the midst of countless hillocks of gymnasium shoes and sweaters and singlets in untidy brown parcels, there stood the stout leather-jacketed vaulting horse, waiting its turn to be carried up on the stage and set in the middle of the winning team at the end of the gymnastic display. Stephen, though in deference to his reputation for essay writing, he had been elected secretary to the gymnasium, had had no part in the first section of the programme, but in the play which formed the second section he had the chief part, that of a farcical pedagogue. He had been cast for it on account of his stature and grave manners, for he was now at the end of his second year at Belvedere and in number 2. A score of the younger boys in white knickers and singlets came pattering down from the stage, through the vestry and into the chapel. The vestry and chapel were peopled with eager masters and boys. The plump, bald sergeant major was testing with his foot the springboard of the vaulting horse. The lean young man in a long overcoat, who was to give a special display of intricate club swinging, stood near watching with interest, his silver-coated clubs peeping out of his deep side pockets. The hollow rattle of the wooden dumbbells was heard as another team made ready to go up on the stage, and in another moment the excited prefect was hustling the boys through the vestry like a flock of geese, flapping the wings of his soutane nervously and crying to the laggards to make haste. A little troop of Neapolitan peasants were practicing their steps at the end of the chapel, some circling their arms above their heads, some swaying their baskets of paper violets and curtsying. In a dark corner of the chapel at the gospel side of the altar, a stout old lady knelt amid her copious black skirts. When she stood up, a pink-dressed figure, wearing a curly golden wig and an old-fashioned straw sunbonnet, with black penciled eyebrows and cheeks delicately rouged and powdered, was discovered. A low murmur of curiosity ran round the chapel at the discovery of this girlish figure. One of the prefects, smiling and nodding his head, approached the dark corner, and having bowed to the stout old lady, said pleasantly, "Is this a beautiful young lady, or a doll that you have here, Mrs. Talon?" Then, bending down to peer at the smiling, painted face under the leaf of the bonnet, he exclaimed, "No! Upon my word, I believe it's little Bertie Talon after all." Stephen, at his post by the window, heard the old lady and the priest laugh together, and heard the boys' murmurs of admiration behind him as they passed forward to see the little boy who had to dance the sunbonnet dance by himself. A movement of impatience escaped him. He let the edge of the blind fall, and stepping down from the bench on which he had been standing, walked out of the chapel. He passed out of the schoolhouse and halted under the shed that flanked the garden. From the theatre opposite came the muffled noise of the audience and sudden brazen clashes of the soldiers' band. The light spread upwards from the glass roof, making the theatre seem a festive ark, anchored among the hulks of houses, her frail cables of lanterns looping her to her moorings. A side door of the theatre opened suddenly, and a shaft of light flew across the grass plots. A sudden burst of music issued from the ark, the prelude of a waltz, and when the side door closed again, the listener could hear the faint rhythm of the music. The sentiment of the opening bars, their languor and supple movement, evoked the incommunicable emotion which had been the cause of all his day's unrest and of his impatient movement of a moment before. His unrest issued from him like a wave of sound, and on the tide of flowing music the ark was journeying, trailing her cables of lanterns in her wake. Then a noise like dwarf artillery broke the movement. It was the clapping that greeted the entry of the dumbbell team on the stage. At the far end of the shed near the street, a speck of pink light showed in the darkness, and as he walked towards it, he became aware of a faint aromatic odour. 2 boys were standing in the shelter of a doorway, smoking, and before he reached them, he had recognized Heron by his voice. "Here comes the noble Daedalus," cried a high, throaty voice. Welcome to our trusty friend." This welcome ended in a soft peal of mirthless laughter as Heron salaamed and then began to poke the ground with his cane. "Here I am," said Stephen, halting and glancing from Heron to his friend. The latter was a stranger to him, but in the darkness, by the aid of the glowing cigarette tips, he could make out a pale, dandyish face over which a smile was travelling slowly, a tall, overcoated figure, and a hard hat. Heron did not trouble himself about an introduction, but said instead, "I was just telling my friend Wallace what a lark it would be tonight if you took off the rector in the part of the schoolmaster. It would be a ripping good joke." Heron made a poor attempt to imitate for his friend Wallace the rector's pedantic bass, and then, laughing at his failure, asked Stephen to do it. "Go on, Daedalus," he urged. "You can take him off rippingly. He that will not hear the churcher, let him be to Thea as the heathena and the publicana." The imitation was prevented by a mild expression of anger from Wallace, in whose mouthpiece the cigarette had become too tightly wedged. "Damn this blankety-blank holder," he said, taking it from his mouth and smiling and frowning upon it tolerantly. "It's always getting stuck like that. Do you use a holder?" "I don't smoke," answered Stephen. "No," said Heron. "Daedalus is a model youth. He doesn't smoke, and he doesn't go to bazaars, and he doesn't flirt, and he doesn't damn anything or damn all." Stephen shook his head and smiled in his rival's flushed and mobile face, beaked like a bird's. He had often thought it strange that Vincent Heron had a bird's face as well as a bird's name. A shock of pale hair lay on the forehead like a ruffled crest. The forehead was narrow and bony, and a thin hook nose stood out between the close-set prominent eyes, which were light and inexpressive. The rivals were school friends. They sat together in class, knelt together in the chapel, talked together after beads over their lunches. As the fellows in number 1 were undistinguished dullards, Stephen and Heron had been during the year the virtual heads of the school. It was they who went up to the rector together to ask for a free day or to get a fellow off. "Oh, by the way," said Heron suddenly, "I saw your governor going in." The smile waned on Stephen's face. Any allusion made to his father by a fellow or by a master put his calm to rout in a moment. He waited in timorous silence to hear what Heron might say next. Heron, however, nudged him expressively with his elbow and said, "You're a sly dog." "Why so?" said Stephen. "You'd think butter wouldn't melt in your mouth," said Heron, "but I'm afraid you're a sly dog." "Might I ask you what you were talking about?" said Stephen urbanely. "Indeed you might," answered Heron. "We saw her, Wallace, didn't we? And deucedly pretty she is too. And inquisitive. And what part does Stephen take, Mr. Daedalus? And will Stephen not sing, Mr. Daedalus?" "Your governor was staring at her through that eyeglass of his for all he was worth, so that I think the old man has found you out too. I wouldn't care a bit, by Jove." "She's ripping, isn't she, Wallace?" "Not half bad," answered Wallace quietly, as he placed his holder once more in a corner of his mouth. A shaft of momentary anger flew through Stephen's mind at these indelicate allusions in the hearing of a stranger. For him, there was nothing amusing in a girl's interest and regard. All day he had thought of nothing but their leave-taking on the steps of the tram at Harold's Cross, the stream of moody emotions it had made to course through him, and the poem he had written about it. All day he had imagined a new meeting with her, for he knew that she was to come to the play. The old restless moodiness had again filled his breast as it had done on the night of the party, but had not found an outlet in verse. The growth and knowledge of 2 years of boyhood stood between then and now, forbidding such an outlet. And all day the stream of gloomy tenderness within him had started forth and returned upon itself in dark courses and eddies, wearying him in the end until the pleasantry of the prefect and the painted little boy had drawn from him a movement of impatience. "So you may as well admit," Heron went on, "that we've fairly found you out this time. You can't play the saint on me any more. That's 1 sure 5. A soft peal of mirthless laughter escaped from his lips, and bending down as before, he struck Stephen lightly across the calf of the leg with his cane, as if in jesting reproof. Stephen's moment of anger had already passed. He was neither flattered nor confused, but simply wished the banter to end. He scarcely resented what had seemed to him a silly indelicateness, for he knew that the adventure in his mind stood in no danger from these words, and his face mirrored his rival's false smile. "Admit," repeated Heron, striking him again with his cane across the calf of the leg. The stroke was playful, but not so lightly given as the first one had been. Stephen felt the skin tingle and glow slightly and almost painlessly, and, bowing submissively as if to meet his companion's jesting mood, began to recite the Confiteor. The episode ended well, for both Heron and Wallace laughed indulgently at the irreverence. The confession came only from Stephen's lips, and while they spoke the words, a sudden memory had carried him to another scene, called up, as if by magic, at the moment when he had noted the faint cruel dimples at the corners of Heron's smiling lips, and had felt the familiar stroke of the cane against his calf, and had heard the familiar word of admonition. Admit. It was towards the close of his first term in the college, when he was in number 6. His sensitive nature was still smarting under the lashes of an undivined and squalid way of life. His soul was still disquieted and cast down by the dull phenomenon of Dublin. He had emerged from a 2 years' spell of reverie to find himself in the midst of a new scene, every event and figure of which affected him intimately, disheartened him or allured, and whether alluring or disheartening, filled him always with unrest and bitter thoughts. All the leisure which his school life left him was passed in the company of subversive writers whose gibes and violence of speech set up a ferment in his brain before they passed out of it into his crude writings. The essay was for him the chief labour of his week, and every Tuesday, as he marched from home to the school, he read his fate in the incidents of the way, pitting himself against some figure ahead of him, and quickening his pace to outstrip it before a certain goal was reached, or planting his steps scrupulously in the spaces of the patchwork of the pathway, and telling himself that he would be first and not first in the weekly essay. On a certain Tuesday, the course of his triumphs was rudely broken. Mr. Tate, the English master, pointed his finger at him and said bluntly, "This fellow has heresy in his essay." A hush fell on the class. Mr. Tate did not break it, but dug with his hand between his thighs while his heavily starched linen creaked about his neck and wrists. Stephen did not look up. It was a raw spring morning, and his eyes were still smarting and weak. He was conscious of failure and of detection, of the squalor of his own mind and home, and felt against his neck the raw edge of his turned and jagged collar. A short, loud laugh from Mr. Tate set the class more at ease. "Perhaps you didn't know that," he said. "Where?" asked Stephen. Mr. Tate withdrew his delving hand and spread out the essay. "Here. It's about the Creator and the soul. Um, 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 ah, without a possibility of ever approaching nearer. That's heresy." Stephen murmured, "I meant without a possibility of ever reaching." It was a submission, and Mr. Tate, appeased, folded up the essay and passed it across to him, saying, "Oh, ever reaching. That's another story." But the class was not so soon appeased. Though nobody spoke to him of the affair after class, he could feel about him a vague, general, malignant joy. A few nights after this public chiding, he was walking with a letter along the Drumcondra road when he heard a voice cry, "Halt!" He turned and saw 3 boys of his own class coming towards him in the dusk. It was Heron who had called out, and as he marched forward between his 2 attendants, he cleft the air before him with a thin cane in time to their steps. Boland, his friend, marched beside him, a large grin on his face, while Nash came on a few steps behind, blowing from the pace and wagging his great red head. As soon as the boys had turned into Clonliffe Road together, they began to speak about books and writers, saying what books they were reading and how many books there were in their father's bookcases at home. Stephen listened to them in some wonderment, for Boland was the dunce and Nash the idler of the class. In fact, after some talk about their favourite writers, Nash declared for Captain Marryat, who, he said, was the greatest writer. "Fudge," said Heron. "Ask Daedalus. Who is the greatest writer, Daedalus?" Stephen noted the mockery in the question and said, "Of prose, do you mean?" "Yes." "Newman, I think." "Is it Cardinal Newman?" asked Boland. "Yes," answered Stephen. The grin broadened on Nash's freckled face as he turned to Stephen and said, "And do you like Cardinal Newman, Daedalus?" "Oh, many say that Newman has the best prose style," Heron said to the other two in explanation. "Of course he's not a poet." "And who is the best poet, Heron?" asked Boland. "Lord Tennyson, of course," answered Heron. "Oh, yes, Lord Tennyson," said Nash. "We have all his poetry at home in a book." At this, Stephen forgot the silent vows he had been making and burst out, "Tennyson a poet? Why, he's only a rhymester." "Oh, get out," said Heron. "Everyone knows that Tennyson is the greatest poet." "And who do you think is the greatest poet?" asked Boland, nudging his neighbour. "Byron, of course," answered Stephen. Heron gave the lead, and all three joined in a scornful laugh. "What are you laughing at?" asked Stephen. "You," said Heron. "Byron, the greatest poet. He's only a poet for uneducated people." "He must be a fine poet," said Boland. "You may keep your mouth shut," said Stephen, turning on him boldly. "All you know about poetry is what you wrote up on the slates in the yard and were going to be sent to the loft for." Boland, in fact, was said to have written on the slates in the yard a couplet about a classmate of his who often rode home from the college on a pony. As Tyson was riding into Jerusalem, he fell and hurt his Alec Kafusalam. This thrust put the two lieutenants to silence, but Heron went on. In any case, Byron was a heretic and immoral too. "I don't care what he was," cried Stephen hotly. "You don't care whether he was a heretic or not," said Nash. "What do you know about it?" shouted Stephen. "You never read a line of anything in your life except a Trans or Boland either." "I know that Byron was a bad man," said Boland. "Here, catch hold of this heretic," Heron called out. In a moment, Stephen was a prisoner. "Tate made you buck up the other day," Heron went on, "about the heresy in your essay." "I'll tell him tomorrow," said Boland. "Will you?" said Stephen. "You'd be afraid to open your lips." "Afraid?" "Haven't you? Afraid of your life." "Behave yourself," cried Heron, cutting at Stephen's legs with his cane. It was the signal for their onset. Nash pinioned his arms behind, while Boland seized a long cabbage stump which was lying in the gutter. Struggling and kicking under the cuts of the cane and the blows of the knotty stump, Stephen was borne back against a barbed wire fence. "Admit that Byron was no good." "Number?" "Admit." "Number?" "Admit." Number. At last, after a fury of plunges, he wrenched himself free. His tormentors set off towards Jones's Road, laughing and jeering at him, while he, half-blinded with tears, stumbled on, clenching his fists madly and sobbing. While he was still repeating the Confiteor amid the indulgent laughter of his hearers, and while the scenes of that malignant episode were still passing sharply and swiftly, before his mind he wondered why he bore no malice now to those who had tormented him. He had not forgotten a whit of their cowardice and cruelty, but the memory of it called forth no anger from him. All the descriptions of fierce love and hatred which he had met in books had seemed to him therefore unreal. Even that night, as he stumbled homewards along Jones's Road, he had felt that some power was divesting him of that sudden woven anger as easily as a fruit is divested of its soft, ripe peel. He remained standing with his two companions at the end of the shed, listening idly to their talk or to the bursts of applause in the theatre. She was sitting there among the others, perhaps waiting for him to appear. He tried to recall her appearance, but could not. He could remember only that she had worn a shawl about her head like a cowl, and that her dark eyes had invited and unnerved him. He wondered had he been in her thoughts as she had been in his. Then, in the dark, and unseen by the other two, he rested the tips of the fingers of one hand upon the palm of the other hand, scarcely touching it lightly. But the pressure of her fingers had been lighter and steadier, and suddenly the memory of their touch traversed his brain and body like an invisible wave. A boy came towards them, running along under the shed. He was excited and breathless. "Oh, Daedalus," he cried, "Doyle is in a great bake about you. You're to go in at once and get dressed for the play. Hurry up, you better." "He's coming now," said Heron to the messenger, with a haughty drawl, "when he wants to." The boy turned to Heron and repeated, "But Doyle is in an awful bake." "Will you tell Doyle with my best compliments that I damned his eyes?" answered Heron. "Well, I must go now," said Stephen, who cared little for such points of honour. "I wouldn't," said Heron. "Damn me if I would. That's no way to send for one of the senior boys. In a bake, indeed. I think it's quite enough that you're taking a part in his bally old play." This spirit of quarrelsome comradeship, which he had observed lately in his rival, had not seduced Stephen from his habits of quiet obedience. He mistrusted the turbulence and doubted the sincerity of such comradeship, which seemed to him a sorry anticipation of manhood. The question of honour here raised was, like all such questions, trivial to him. While his mind had been pursuing its intangible phantoms and turning in irresolution from such pursuit, he had heard about him the constant voices of his father and of his masters, urging him to be a gentleman above all things, and urging him to be a good Catholic above all things. These voices had now come to be hollow sounding in his ears. When the gymnasium had been opened, he had heard another voice urging him to be strong and manly and healthy, and when the movement towards national revival had begun to be felt in the college, yet another voice had bidden him be true to his country and help to raise up her language and tradition. In the profane world, as he foresaw, a worldly voice would bid him raise up his father's fallen state by his labours, and meanwhile the voice of his school comrades urged him to be a decent fellow, to shield others from blame or to beg them off, and to do his best to get free days for the school. And it was the din of all these hollow-sounding voices that made him halt irresolutely in the pursuit of phantoms. He gave them ear only for a time, but he was happy only when he was far from them, beyond their call, alone or in the company of phantasmal comrades. In the vestry, a plump, fresh-faced Jesuit and an elderly man, in shabby blue clothes, were dabbling in a case of paints and chalks. The boys who had been painted walked about or stood still awkwardly, touching their faces in a gingerly fashion with their furtive fingertips. In the middle of the vestry, a young Jesuit, who was then on a visit to the college, stood rocking himself rhythmically from the tips of his toes to his heels and back again, his hands thrust well forward into his side pockets, his small head set off with glossy red curls, and his newly shaven face agreed well with the spotless decency of his soutane and with his spotless shoes. As he watched this swaying form and tried to read for himself the legend of the priest's mocking smile, there came into Stephen's memory a saying which he had heard from his father before he had been sent to Clongowes, that you could always tell a Jesuit by the style of his clothes. At the same moment he thought he saw a likeness between his father's mind and that of this smiling, well-dressed priest, and he was aware of some desecration of the priest's office or of the vestry itself, whose silence was now routed by loud talk and joking, and its air pungent with the smells of the gas jets and the grease. While his forehead was being wrinkled and his jaws painted black and blue by the elderly man, he listened distractedly to the voice of the plump young Jesuit, which bade him speak up and make his points clearly. He could hear the band playing the Lily of Killarney, and knew that in a few moments the curtain would go up. He felt no stage fright, but the thought of the part he had to play humiliated him. A remembrance of some of his lines made a sudden flush rise to his painted cheeks. He saw her serious, alluring eyes watching him from among the audience, and their image at once swept away his scruples, leaving his will compact. Another nature seemed to have been lent him. The infection of the excitement and youth about him entered into and transformed his moody mistrustfulness. For one rare moment, he seemed to be clothed in the real apparel of boyhood, and, as he stood in the wings among the other players, he shared the common mirth amid which the drop scene was hauled upwards by two able-bodied priests with violent jerks and all awry. A few moments after, he found himself on the stage amid the garish gas and the dim scenery, acting before the innumerable faces of the void. It surprised him to see that the play, which he had known at rehearsals for a disjointed, lifeless thing, had suddenly assumed a life of its own. It seemed now to play itself, he and his fellow actors aiding it with their parts. When the curtain fell on the last scene, he heard the void filled with applause, and through a rift in a side scene, saw the simple body before which he had acted magically deformed, the void of faces breaking at all points and falling asunder into busy groups. He left the stage quickly and rid himself of his mummery and passed out through the chapel into the college garden. Now that the play was over, his nerves cried for some further adventure. He hurried onwards, as if to overtake it. The doors of the theatre were all open, and the audience had emptied out. On the lines which he had fancied the moorings of an ark, a few lanterns swung in the night breeze, flickering cheerlessly. He mounted the steps from the garden in haste, eager that some prey should not elude him, and forced his way through the crowd in the hall and past the two Jesuits who stood watching the exodus and bowing and shaking hands with the visitors. He pushed onward nervously, feigning a still greater haste, and faintly conscious of the smiles and stares and nudges which his powdered head left in its wake. When he came out on the steps, he saw his family waiting for him at the first lamp. In a glance, he noted that every figure of the group was familiar and ran down the steps angrily. "I have to leave a message down in George's Street," he said to his father quickly. "I'll be home after you." Without waiting for his father's questions, he ran across the road and began to walk at breakneck speed down the hill. He hardly knew where he was walking. Pride and hope and desire, like crushed herbs in his heart, sent up vapours of maddening incense before the eyes of his mind. He strode down the hill amid the tumult of sudden risen vapours, of wounded pride and fallen hope and baffled desire. They streamed upwards before his anguished eyes in dense and maddening fumes, and passed away above him till at last the air was clear and cold again. A film still veiled his eyes, but they burned no longer. A power, akin to that which had often made anger or resentment fall from him, brought his steps to rest. He stood still and gazed up at the sombre porch of the morgue, and from that to the dark cobbled laneway at its side. He saw the word "Lots" on the wall of the lane, and breathed slowly the rank, heavy air. "That is horse piss and rotted straw," he thought. "It is a good odour to breathe. It will calm my heart. My heart is quite calm now. I will go back." Stephen was once again seated beside his father in the corner of a railway carriage at Kingsbridge. He was travelling with his father by the night mail to Cork. As the train steamed out of the station, he recalled his childish wonder of years before and every event of his first day at Clongowes. But he felt no wonder now. He saw the darkening lands slipping away past him, the silent telegraph poles passing his window swiftly every 4 seconds, the little glimmering stations manned by a few silent sentries, flung by the mail behind her and twinkling for a moment in the darkness like fiery grains flung backwards by a runner. He listened without sympathy to his father's evocation of Cork and of scenes of his youth, a tale broken by sighs or draughts from his pocket flask whenever the image of some dead friend appeared in it, or whenever the evoker remembered suddenly the purpose of his actual visit. Stephen heard but could feel no pity. The images of the dead were all strangers to him, save that of Uncle Charles, an image which had lately been fading out of memory. He knew, however, that his father's property was going to be sold by auction, and in the manner of his own dispossession he felt the world give the lie rudely to his fantasy. At Maryborough he fell asleep. When he awoke, the train had passed out of Mallow, and his father was stretched asleep on the other seat. The cold light of the dawn lay over the country, over the unpeopled fields and the closed cottages. The terror of sleep fascinated his mind as he watched the silent country or heard from time to time his father's deep breath or sudden sleepy movement. The neighbourhood of unseen sleepers filled him with strange dread, as though they could harm him, and he prayed that the day might come quickly. His prayer, addressed neither to God nor saint, began with a shiver as the chilly morning breeze crept through the chink of the carriage door to his feet, and ended in a trail of foolish words which he made to fit the insistent rhythm of the train. And silently, at intervals of 4 seconds, the telegraph poles held the galloping notes of the music between punctual bars. This furious music allayed his dread, and leaning against the window ledge, he let his eyelids close again. They drove in a jingle across Cork while it was still early morning, and Stephen finished his sleep in a bedroom of the Victoria Hotel. The bright, warm sunlight was streaming through the window, and he could hear the din of traffic. His father was standing before the dressing table, examining his hair and face and moustache with great care, craning his neck across the water jug and drawing it back sideways to see the better. While he did so, he sang softly to himself with quaint accent and phrasing, "'Tis youth and folly makes young men marry. So here, my love, I'll no longer stay. What can't be cured, sure, must be injured, sure. So I'll go to America. My love, she's handsome, my love, she's bony. She's like good whiskey. When it is new, but when 'tis old, and growing cold, it fades and dies like the mountain dew." The consciousness of the warm, sunny city outside his window and the tender tremors with which his father's voice festooned the strange, sad, happy air drove off all the mists of the night's ill humor from Stephen's brain. He got up quickly to dress, and when the song had ended said, "That's much prettier than any of your other come-all-yous." "Do you think so?" asked Mr. Dedalus. "I like it," said Stephen. "It's a pretty old air," said Mr. Dedalus, twirling the points of his moustache. "Ah, but you should have heard Mick Lacey sing it." "Poor Mick Lacey. He had little turns for it, grace notes that he used to put in that I haven't got. That was the boy who could sing a come-all-you, if you like." Mr. Dedalus had ordered dressines for breakfast, and during the meal he cross-examined the waiter for local news. For the most part, they spoke at cross purposes when a name was mentioned, the waiter having in mind the present holder and Mr. Dedalus his father, or perhaps his grandfather. "Well, I hope they haven't moved the Queen's College anyhow," said Mr. Dedalus, "for I want to show it to this youngster of mine." Along the Mardyke the trees were in bloom. They entered the grounds of the college and were led by the garrulous porter across the quadrangle. But their progress across the gravel was brought to a halt after every dozen or so paces by some reply of the porter's. "Ah, do you tell me so? And is poor Pottlebelly dead?" "Yes, sir. Dead, sir." During these halts, Stephen stood awkwardly behind the two men, weary of the subject and waiting restlessly for the slow march to begin again. By the time they had crossed the quadrangle, his restlessness had risen to fever. He wondered how his father, whom he knew for a shrewd, suspicious man, could be duped by the servile manners of the porter, and the lively southern speech which had entertained him all the morning now irritated his ears. They passed into the anatomy theatre, where Mr. Dedalus, the porter aiding him, searched the desks for his initials. Stephen remained in the background, depressed more than ever by the darkness and silence of the theatre, and by the air it wore of jaded and formal study. On the desk he read the word "Fatus" cut several times in the dark-stained wood. The sudden legend startled his blood. He seemed to feel the absent students of the college about him, and to shrink from their company. A vision of their life, which his father's words had been powerless to evoke, sprang up before him out of the word cut in the desk. A broad-shouldered student with a moustache was cutting in the letters with a jackknife, seriously. Other students stood or sat near him, laughing at his handiwork. One jogged his elbow. The big student turned on him, frowning. He was dressed in loose grey clothes and had tan boots. Stephen's name was called. He hurried down the steps of the theatre so as to be as far away from the vision as he could be, and peering closely at his father's initials, hid his flushed face. But the word and the vision capered before his eyes as he walked back across the quadrangle and towards the college gate. It shocked him to find in the outer world a trace of what he had deemed till then a brutish and individual malady of his own mind. His monstrous reveries came thronging into his memory. They too had sprung up before him, suddenly and furiously, out of mere words. He had soon given in to them and allowed them to sweep across and abase his intellect, wondering always where they came from what den of monstrous images, and always weak and humble towards others, restless and sickened of himself when they had swept over him. "Aye, bedad, and there's the groceries, sure enough," cried Mr. Dedalus. You often heard me speak of the groceries, didn't you, Stephen? Many's the time we went down there when our names had been marked, a crowd of us. Harry Peard and little Jack Mountain and Bob Dias and Maurice Moriarty, the Frenchman, and Tom O'Grady and Mick Lacey that I told you of this morning, and Joey Corbett and poor little good-hearted Johnny Keevers of the Tantals. The leaves of the trees along the Mardyke were astir and whispering in the sunlight. A team of cricketers passed, agile young men in flannels and blazers, one of them carrying the long green wicket bag. In a quiet by-street, a German band of 5 players in faded uniforms and with battered brass instruments was playing to an audience of street Arabs and leisurely messenger boys. A maid in a white cap and apron was watering a box of plants on a sill which shone like a slab of limestone in the warm glare. From another window open to the air came the sound of a piano, scale after scale rising into the treble. Stephen walked on at his father's side, listening to stories he had heard before, hearing again the names of the scattered and dead revellers who had been the companions of his father's youth. And a faint sickness sighed in his heart. He recalled his own equivocal position in Belvedere, a free boy, a leader afraid of his own authority, proud and sensitive and suspicious, battling against the squalor of his life and against the riot of his mind. The letters cut in the stained wood of the desk stared upon him, mocking his bodily weakness and futile enthusiasms, and making him loathe himself for his own mad and filthy orgies. The spittle in his throat grew bitter and foul to swallow, and the faint sickness climbed to his brain so that for a moment he closed his eyes and walked on in darkness.